And now for more analysis, we are joined by geopolitical analyst Mr. Ali K Elyader from Isfahan in Iran. Thank you so much for joining us here. And well, sir, Araghchi says diplomacy with Washington is still possible, but only if the US changes its approach. Look, is Tehran genuinely open to negotiations?
Greetings, Ms. Pauline. Thank you for having me again. Honestly, Mr. Araghchi, who is essentially a spokesman for Iranian policymakers and Iranian policy, and from every level and layer of Iranian policymakers, the government, the military, Mr. Mohsen Rezai's statements recently, if the Americans would have honored their signature on the MOU and the framework in the MOU set by the MOU, which clearly outlines what needs to be done to have stability and security in the region. The MOU, I think, is also clear on the realities on the ground. It's on point number 5. It has stipulated that the Strait of Hormuz and the waterways near Iran and Oman should be governed, managed by Iran and Oman, and obviously with the input of the regional players. After the JCPOA, we do not have any official framework for peace and any kind of agreement. The only framework that we had was the MOU. Therefore, I think Iran has been clear, and Mr. Araghchi's statements echo that clarity, and that is that if parameters of the MOU are met, and if there is a cessation or a stop of the hostilities against the Lebanese, against the Gazans, against the Yemenis, because that's also point number 1 in the MOU. If this threatening rhetoric by the Americans stops, which is also the rhetoric and threats are also mentioned in the MOU, and if Iran's territorial integrity, their security, regional territorial integrity, we've seen the Americans insult the Omanis in recent weeks and months, threatening to bomb them twice, insult the Saudis. And if the Americans follow proper diplomacy, responsible diplomacy, then I think, yes, Iran would be open to looking at negotiations again. But if these continuous criminal warring paths and rhetoric, threats of sanctions and sieges, then obviously Iran will not accept diplomacy and probably will retaliate in a different manner, because Iran now sees sanctions also as an act of war that affects the common Iranian on the street as well.
And you just mentioned a couple of things. What is that is preventing both sides from returning to the negotiation table? Is there anything else we can add to that list?
Responsible diplomacy by the Americans. I mean, the days are gone. I mean, I'm not a fan of Henry Kissinger, but Kissinger was famous for shuttle diplomacy. Americans in the past were perhaps more shrewd in understanding regional players, understanding regional cultures. Kissinger had mentioned to Mr. Larijani that Iran is a 1,000-year-old civilization. They need to be respected. Whereas the new team the Trump administration has assembled, the likes of Kushner and Witkoff, with the zero diplomatic competence, zero political competence. And instead of the Americans having their tails wagged by the Israelis and their criminal, hegemonic, terroristic ambitions, returning to sanity, returning to responsible diplomacy that respects all the regional players is a must. And again, quoting Mohsen Rezai, he said that if no oil is sent out of the Strait of Hormuz, if no Iranian oil is sent out of the Strait of Hormuz, other countries won't also be able to send their oil out. So Iran is not going to stand back and let the status quo exist. And I also think that American sanctions will have a diminishing effect ongoing, with several payment options and banking options that are going to be propping up in recent months and years. But again, back to your question, I think proper, responsible, realistic diplomacy without delusion. Basically, Americans need to wake up that they have perhaps won this war strategically, even if they want to somehow announce a victory like the Americans usually want to do. The world understands that they lost this war strategically and now maybe graciously accept diplomacy, accept mutual respect, and maybe we'll have some kind of peace going forward if that is the American stance.
Right, Mr. Elyader, let's talk about the sea mines now. The U.S. says it has cleared Iranian sea mines and reopened international shipping lanes in Hormuz. Here, how does Tehran view this claim, and what is the situation on the ground?
Iran understands that, and I think several journalists, several analysts, both military, political analysts, economic analysts, understand that the American rhetoric is filled with lies and manipulation. Perhaps these statements are also some form of manipulation to get the markets to rest down, settle down a little bit. We're seeing huge chaos arising from the energy markets. We're seeing the strategic petroleum reserves of America itself depleting, their gas prices going high. They're having a bond market catastrophe. The Fed is printing money to buy back American bonds. A lot of American allies even are threatening to dump American bonds. So I think by making such fantastical claims of having demined the Persian Gulf or the Strait of Hormuz is just pure rhetoric, lies, and manipulation. I think we would have to take the Iranian statements more at face value. They have usually acted on what they have said. They have when verifiable data has shown that the Iranians are more truthful in their statements, and we haven't seen American vessels like the Abraham Lincoln and so on come into the Persian Gulf waterway. So how they demine them is baffling. But I think again, it's just simple lying, manipulating rhetoric, and Iran sees it at that. The Strait of Hormuz has to be managed and by responsible parties, meaning the coastal jurisdiction, the legal jurisdiction falls as per maritime law on the shoulders of the Omanis and the Iranians, and obviously other regional players that use the Strait of Hormuz. International intervention is not what this region requires. In fact, some kind of de-intervention or lack of foreign intervention is what the region requires. And I think the Americans also need to wake up to that fact. That's why the Iranians are negotiating with Oman directly in recent weeks to reach a final settlement for the Strait of Hormuz and demining procedures.
Right, and look, we have also the following picture here. U.S. economic pressure is it's continuing, and Iran demands respect for its rights and commitments. So in this, U.S. versus Iran situation here, what could be the next realistic path toward de-escalation?
Again, I think this is a little bit of a bluff game, these sanction regimes and these so-called fantastical claims of these sanctions being the most rigorous, maximum pressure sanctions. The Americans have made these statements over the decades. And I mentioned before, I'll say it again, sanctions is a form of criminal sadism. It's a sadistic behavior that affects the people who require medicine, who are deprived of medicine. But Iran understood this. They learned from their mistakes in the past or the threats of sanctions. They have workarounds. You see the Caspian Sea trade route being expanded and optimized between the Russians, the Caucasus nations around the Caspian Sea. Iran has land routes all the way to China. It will probably want to develop and optimize those routes as well in order to avoid the impact of American sanctions as well. And I mentioned that there will be other kind of transactional systems, banking systems that will not be so much attached to the US dollar or the American SWIFT banking system or the Western banking system. Therefore, the Americans need to understand these sanctions are also a depreciating leverage or depreciating asset that they can use on the Iranians. Iranians have been provoked since the 1950s with the coup of Mossadegh. Americans should understand they should stop provoking, threatening, poking the bear, so to speak. Americans should perhaps wake up to the fact that the main population center, the main landmass, the main military power of the Persian Gulf is Iran. And respect its territorial integrity if they want to salvage the relationships that they have with the GCC countries as well. And perhaps then we can look at some kind of peace and prosperity forward. But in order to continue with these sanctions threats, you're not going to create anything but continuous instability, especially for the global economy. Perhaps this time the American economy will be damaged more than the Iranian economy with the sanctions, as the Strait of Hormuz passageway will continue to be affected if sanctions are imposed on Iran.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Ali K Elyader, joining us from Isfahan here on Asiaone. I appreciate your time.